Oh, hey, I didn't I didn't see you there. Must be live again. I'm guessing it's another Tuesday night, which would mean it's time for another episode of The Unexpected Cosmology. The Natsarim. Hopefully that's what you guys showed up for tonight, because that's what I'm going over. Christianity versus the Millennial Kingdom. Boy, oh boy. I might be in some hot water tonight. Originally I planned to give this little talk last week, and I was all set to go and everything. And then I stumbled upon some more information, some unexpected information. Of course, this is the Unexpected Cosmology, and just blew me out of the water. I was planning to give like a little meat and potatoes talk about the Natsarim, but tonight we're going to be talking about the Millennial Kingdom and how it's a Natsarim idea. So let's get right into it. You'll have to give me a little bit of time to build my case, of course, too. By yours truly, of course, Noel Joshua Hadley. You can see that I just finished that last month, at least the earliest iteration of it. Here is the patience of the Kodashim. Those would be the set apart. So let's try this again. Here is the patience of the set apart. Here are they that keep the commandments of Elohim and the faith of Yahusha HaMashiach. Revelation 14:12 just so happens to be the Bible memory verse of the decade around these parts. It's what I base my entire ministry upon. When the newbies ask, what are your core beliefs? And also, can I get a chapter and verse to back up your claim? I point them to that one. There are three separate instances in Revelation when the accuser, that would be Hasatan, is said to be at war with the set apart, the Kodashim, and clearly getting them to break the commands of Allahayam, that would be the paleo for Elohim or God, is his top priority. Or else, how can he accuse if he can't get you to break the commands? Getting them to deny. I need a little bit more coffee. Stand by. Let's try that again. Getting them to deny Mashiach is easier than most think, especially when one acknowledges that Yahusha not only kept his father's commands, all 613 of them, but he also instructed his followers to do the same. By the way, I've just defined for you the Natsarim. Even according to the modern hit pieces of our spiritual controllers, the Natsarim are described as those who keep the Father's commands and the testimony of Yahusha HaMashiach, Revelation 14:12. Well, this much is true, except when they do it, they spin obedience to our Creator in icky poo terms. They have names for it and all that sort of stuff, complete with baby booby names like Jew, or you may have heard of this one, Judaizer. They make it out like the slippery slope to hell is obedience rather than disobedience, because apparently that's what Satan wants you to do now. He wants you to be disobedient to the commands. I'm sorry. I messed that one up. Apparently now Satan wants you to be obedient, whereas in the past he wanted you to be disobedient. But now, if you are obedient to the commands, you are listening to the accuser, because you're not supposed to do that. The propaganda department is regularly featured in these parts, but rarely is their target more apparent than with the war on the Natsarim. Pay attention to who would have you disobey the commands when whispering into your ear, did God really say? Where have we heard that one before? The fact of the matter is, the Natsarim never recognize any teaching or authority other than Messiah, Yahusha HaMashiach, or Jesus Christ, if you prefer. I, for one, think that's a novel idea. Go with what the Son of God, the Logos, the light of the world, and the Lamb has to say regarding the truth, rather than a prophet or an apostle who might, I don't know, come along in a later decade with a socket wrench, hoping to tweak a thing or two. I mean, I can totally see why the lawless would deplore anyone who goes by Mashiach's words alone. The persecutors of the Natsarim tossed them into the heretic pile because they obeyed the commandments and ignored their teaching authority, thereby making them uncontrollable. Good and upright is Yahuwah. That would be the paleo for Yahuwah. Therefore, he teaches sinners in the way. The humble he guides in justice, and the humble he teaches his way. All the paths of Yahuwah are mercy and truth to such as keep his covenant and his testimonies. For your name's sake, O Yahuwah, pardon my iniquity, for it is great. Psalms 25, 8 through 11. Now, the word Natsar is a Hebrew one, and as you may have already guessed, can be located all throughout Hebrew scripture. It is Strong's Hebrew Concordance 5341 and means to guard, watch, preserve, and keep. I have just given you one such example. According to Psalms 25:10, Yahuwah teaches sinners the way, his way being mercy and truth to those who keep Natsar, his covenant. So as you can see, the very word Natsarim has keeping his covenant embedded within it. Those on the wide road of existence will claim they needn't guard, watch, preserve, or keep the commands of Yahuwah anymore because of the quote-unquote new covenant, which has apparently done away with the old. And so without even batting an eye, they will ultimately tell you that 95% of the Bible is Jewish. See my quotations today? I'll be doing a lot of that. Jewish, outdated, no longer the standard of truth, and certainly not to be obeyed. Because did God really say? Because apparently only Satan would want you to do so when trying to convince you that you need to repent and turn to the Bible. Does that make any sense whatsoever? The cognitive dissonance is strong with this one. I mean, I get a headache just having to listen, like the energy of the cognitive dissonance that comes my way. My head hurts for other people on this one. Paul didn't call it the strong delusion for nothing. And there's a link right there. That was a presentation I just gave last week. And, you know, people, one of the comments I got afterwards is like, oh, there's tons of strong delusions out there. Actually, the context is one strong delusion that would overtake perhaps the believers, and it has to do with the Antichrist and the destruction of the temple. Natsar actually has a dual meaning. It means to keep, but it also indicates a branch. One number over from Strong's H5341 is H5342, Netzer, which, as I just mentioned, is defined as a sprout or shoot. That is to say, those who keep his commands are pictured as the branch of a tree. What happens if they don't keep his commands? Why? They are removed. Already, numerous scriptural passages are likely springing to your attention, as the theme of Yashreel being a tree is consistent throughout, even in Paul's letters. And so here's how Yahushua HaMashiach grafts the two meanings together into one coherent image. I am the vine, you are the branches. The one abiding in me and I in him, he bears much fruit, for apart from me, you are able to do nothing. That comes from Bezorah Yochanan, or the Gospel of John 15:5. In the Greek, the word being employed is klima, or klima, which happens to mean the same thing. Believe it or not, there is the Hebrew New Testament, or as we like to say, the Renewed Testament. I have personally led studies on the books contained within, and am more than happy to report in the Hebrew, Yochanan 15:5 uses the word netzer, or contrarily, Natsar in the Paleo-Hebrew. And of course, if you were to go back to the Greek LXX, you're going to find the same thing in the Old Testament, that the Greek lines up with the Hebrew. Really, there's no reason for a language barrier. If the Hebrew NT is currently not your cup of tea, oh, but it will be. The prophet Yeshayahu, Isaiah, uses the branch word. And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Yeshe, that'd be Jesse, and a branch, Netzer, shall grow out of his roots. Isaiah 11:1. Yeshayahu is prophesying of the coming Mashiach, which then, in turn, had Yahusha referring back to Yeshayahu when making the vine and branches quip in Yochanan 15:5. Actually, Matthew did as well. And this is what he says. Now, keep in mind, Matthew was also originally written in Hebrew. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets. He shall be called a Natsarim. Matthew 2:23. Long ago, way at the bottom of the hundreds of papers I've written, I once insinuated that Matthew was perchance referring to a prophetic book, which we no longer have in our possession. It just goes to show that I stumbled right over one of those Home Alone burglar traps, falling flat on my back. Obviously, Matthew was employing a pun. The pun was intended, probably as a rhetorical effect, to connect the word branch with the city of the branch. You see what he did there? To quote from Nathaniel, "Can anything good come from the city of the branch?" Oh, I get jokes. I see what you did there. Funny stuff, Nathaniel. LOL. It's a wonder that your fallback position of stand-up comedian didn't work out. On closer inspection, it seems as though Yahusha was quite literally using a play on words as well when stating in Yochanan 15:5, that would be John, that you cannot be a watchman of his Father's commands unless you first abide in him, behaving as he behaves. You see how that works? Because he is the vine, you see. And a branch would have to be very naughty to think it can originate with the vine or even be grafted into the vine while obstinately disobeying his Father's commands. We are not expected to think that way, though. I mean, the Greek Christianity would have us think we could be mixed fruit, that an apple can grow on an orange tree, that a plum can grow on a vineyard. Becoming a Natsarim couldn't be any simpler than that. The sheep hear the voice of their shepherd, he knows them, and in turn, they follow. They follow the way which he has provided. And there's a reference, a chapter and verse for you right there, Yochanan 10:27-28. And of course, Yahusha can do nothing apart from what the Father does. Yochanan 5:19. The two are perfectly in sync. Contrarily, it is our controllers who complicate everything in their attempts to muddle the waters, confuse you into thinking that abiding in Yahusha somehow implies disobeying the very commands which characterize our Father in heaven. That's a doctrine of demons straight from the pit of Sheol, if ever I've heard one. There are no shortage of excuses either, and probably hundreds, if not thousands, of denominational doctrines aimed at giving you an out. But then, from beginning to end, the Bible begins to make a whole lot more sense. And we're talking 2020 vision when we finally read and then do what it says. Nope, our controllers won't like that. This is the story of the Natsarim. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, I have already mentioned. More like insinuated when dropping a link to another paper, The Strong Delusion, which I covered last week, which is a part of a much larger canon involving my research into the glorious appearing. Because that's one excuse that keeps coming up again and again and again and again. Let's see if I got this right. The original followers of Mashiach kept the commands because they were Jewish, but now his followers needn't keep the commands anymore because the temple was destroyed. Did I get that right? There are also the but Paul people. They're everywhere. We shan't forget about them. I won't leave you out of this conversation, I promise. You've probably heard the one where Yahuwah's truth is no longer the standard for righteous living, and that 95% of the Bible is disproven, and all because Paul says so. Oh man, what a can of worms that is. Well, anyways, before the judgment event directed upon those who failed the Revelation 14:12 principle on both counts, rejecting the commands as well as the testimony of Mashiach, the Natsarim were mentioned at the, wait for it, the trial of Paul. And this is what we read. For we are having found this man a pestilent fellow. These are the temple controllers speaking. A very pestilent fellow and mover of sedition among all the Yahudim, those would be the Jews, throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarene. Dun, dun, dun. Acts of the Apostles 24:5. Am I mistaken, or did the temple controllers just name Paul the ringleader of the Nazarene? They did. And remember now, the very word Natsarim has obeying the commands, guarding the commands embedded within the very word. They're accusing him of keeping the commands. The Natsarim are furthermore described as a sect. A sect of what exactly? Well, if I had to guess, the Natsarim were an extension of the Hebrew faith rather than some other religion, and it only makes sense that it would be. Supposing Paul was another religion entirely, then why were the Yahudim even putting him to trial? That's weird. Sorry, you can't do away with the Torah, which is the very foundation of Yasharel, your identity in Yasharel, to be a Hebrew, and still claim to be the same religion. Therefore, if Paul was entering into the synagogues to disrupt the Yahudim religion, or supposing he had entered the holy places of any other religion to cause sedition, then he should have been put on trial, assuming that is what he was even doing, and he wasn't. The Nazarene were clearly a sect of the Hebrew faith, and Paul wasn't doing away with anything. I've covered this already in my Paul on Trial paper. You can read it, go to my website, download it, read it, find the reading on YouTube somewhere, buried under all my other videos. The Yahudim were falsely accusing him of doing away with the Torah, just as our spiritual controllers do today. There is a conspiracy for you. Paul was a patsy. This is where it gets really good. The Jew tax. Have you ever heard of fiscus? I guess that's Judaicus, or it'd be Judaicus. It is a Latin word for a Jewish tax, and was imposed on the Yahudim after the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in 70 AD. Now, Wiki has an article on this one. Allow me to go over the details. The tax was initially enacted by Emperor Vespasian as a revenge tactic against the war peddlers, though it was imposed on all Yahudim throughout the empire, not just upon those who took part in the revolt. The tax was more like a tithe amounting to 2 denarii, which just so happens to be the equivalent to the 1/2 shekel that had previously been paid for the upkeep of the temple. Ouch. That's not the whole of it, though. I take the time to copy and paste this stuff. You can see right there a quote that I took a snip out of a wiki to show you. I take the time to copy and paste this stuff so that you can't very well claim I'm making it up. Some of it's so incriminating because the truth is stranger than fiction. Can I get an amen? Vespasian had a son named Titus who succeeded him, but then Titus had a little brother named Domitian. And here is what we read about him. Soon after planting his bum on daddy's throne and of course, big brother's throne in 81 AD, Domitian thought it a good idea to expand the Jew tax, the fiscus judaicus, beyond converts to Judaism to affect those who simply observed Jewish customs. What is a Jewish custom exactly? I bet we could put our heads together and name some. Passover and Sukkot comes to mind. Those would be two of the feasts of Yahuwah. Of course, there's 7 feasts of Yahuwah. Or how about the Sabbath? That sounds a little bit Jewish. Sounds suspiciously Jewish. It would be a shame if someone skipped out on the synagogue to avoid the tax man as he snooped around in the ghetto looking to see if any lazy people were taking the day off on Sabbath. But then the historian, I guess that's Suetonius, even recalled an old man of 90 years old who was inspected, and he personally saw this, was inspected to see whether or not he was circumcised. Whoops. Look, if there's anything I know about conservatives, it's that they don't like being taxed. What better reason for twisting Paul's words into lawlessness, making him a patsy, than scrimping on a denarii or two? Oh, but there's more. You can see I took another clipping out on Wikipedia. The Jew tax was replete with blackmail. All one had to do was accuse their neighbor of being a Judaizer, and it was time to lift the toga for the inquisitor, or else pay the temple tax. The Jew tax even led to a certain Titus Flavius Clemens receiving the death penalty on the claims of, quote, living a Jewish life. Keeping the Sabbath, are we? Recognize the name Flavius, just like a certain Flavius Josephus we know. I just checked. Titus Flavius Clemens was a Roman politician, but even more so, he was Domitian's cousin. Dang. What happened? He skipped out on the family gathering on Sol Invictus come December 25th, asked if it had pork in it at the Baptist picnic, or perhaps sending out the invite for the Sukkot camping trip got him labeled a Judaizer. We haven't gotten to Ignatius quite yet, but when we do, his own blackmail attempts will finally make a whole lot of contextual sense. There are so many juicy nuggets in this short read, and again, I'm going through the Wikipedia article, that I'm fighting off the temptation to copy and paste the entire article. That's not my style. I'm just saying, if ever there was an occasion, this might be the one. I mean, check out these informative lines. At the time when the Jew tax was enacted, the Christians did, and I'm quoting from it, the Christians did not yet consider their religion to be separate from Judaism. And of course, this is quoting some very prominent Christian historians here. You mean they hadn't done away with the Torah yet? To quote the next line, if anything, they would have considered themselves as a Jewish sect, indicating that even non-Jewish Christians would have been liable to the tax. Oh, gee, I wonder what name they went by. Natsarim, was it? If being a Torah-observant follower of Mashiach is heretical in today's world, then the awkward part is that the first century followers of Mashiach were quite heretical. But that's probably none of my business, nor is it yours. One more pimple in the narrative involves not having to sacrifice to the Roman gods. The reason why one wouldn't have to sacrifice to the gods has more to do with whether or not they paid their Jew tax like a good, circumcised, kosher fellow. And now reverse that. Does that also mean those who weren't paying the Jew tax were in reality sacrificing to the gods? It sure does read that way. Sacrifice to Caesar, or else get labeled a Jew. This sounds more and more like a mark of the beast situation, if you want my opinion on it. I have two separate papers on that, which I highly suggest you read. The first would be the Mark of Yah. It's actually called the Mark of Yah or the Mark of the Beast. Which will you choose? And then there, of course, is the 666 number. Though Constantine versus the Millennial Kingdom is definitely applicable to what we're going to be talking about. I mean, how many Christians go out of the Jew tax? Or let me say that again. How many Christians got out of the Jew tax by ceasing and desisting from the 613, only to face a resulting sacrifice scenario? Is that what was happening? Were they going with the old God knows my heart routine? There he is. The one and only, will the real Ignatius please stand up? Such a sad picture, too. He's getting eaten by a lion and a hyena. Sad times. So anyways, the fig tree generation ended in 70 AD, after which there is a lull for a few decades where little to nothing is known of Christianity, or scratch that, or I mean the Natsarim. And then somebody called Ignatius of Antioch arrives on the scene to flip everything on its head. Antioch identifies a city in Syria from whence he derives, whereas the very name Ignatius indicates a changing of the guard. He is said to have been born around 50 AD, with his martyrdom landing sometime around 108. Tradition paints Yochanan as the bishop of Antioch, and Ignatius as a disciple of his, who in turn succeeded him as the next bishop. Of course, there's conflicting traditions on this, because Yochanan is more likely seen as being in Ephesus, but they like to paint Ignatius as a disciple of Yochanan so they could, for misdirection purposes. Of course, that would also explain Ignatius' connection with Polycarp, seeing as how the bishop of Smyrna was also said to be numbered among Yochanan's apprentices. And we'll touch more on that tonight. I have to say, the claims given to us are odd to say the least, and here's why. There is no evidence that Ignatius had the Gospel of Mark at his disposal. His familiarity with Luke is inconclusive, and the use of Yochanan or John or any of John's writings, or on that matter, is unlikely. That last part is particularly puzzling when one considers his claimed pupillage under the apostle. You'd think he'd be quoting him left or right, but he doesn't. He doesn't quote him once. None that I can find. And I've read his letters over dozens of times now, searching for clues. What does seem evident is that Ignatius had given Matthew's gospel read, so there's a plus, which is undoubtedly of interest since Matthew was not only written in Hebrew, but it was also the favorite text of the very Natsarim whom Ignatius was attempting to wrestle the keys of the kingdom away from. One thing seems absolutely certain in all of this. For men like Ignatius and Marcion, Paul was the sole voice of his religion. With a twist of the lemon, the Torah was expected to be interpreted according to Paul's writings and not the other way around. And so you can see what is at stake. And I'm not referring to the stake which Ignatius was possibly tied to, or the stake which he became so as to secure his vision. There's another play on words for you. The story of Ignatius is a somewhat strange one because we would not even know of his existence had it not been for his supposed martyrdom. He arrives as a blip on the screen only after being sent to Rome in a detachment of 10 soldiers, and then disappears from the radar again. At a fork in the road, somewhere in the midst of Asia Minor, probably Laodicea, his jailers made an impromptu decision. Knowing that he maintained a show of support along the Mediterranean coast, particularly in Magnesia and Ephesus, they changed their itinerary, preferring the northern route through Philadelphia and perhaps Sardis, meeting up at last with Smyrna. Whenever you hear me stumble like that, you know I need more coffee. Along the way, Ignatius wrote a series of letters. In fact, he wrote 7 of them officially. In Smyrna, a delegation was prepared. He then wrote another letter to Rome, alerting Christians to his soon arrival. And then eventually he got around to writing to his fellow alumni, Polycarp. They are as follows: Ephesians, Magnesians, Trallians, Romans, Philadelphians, Smyrnians, and Polycarp. Never let a good death march go to waste, I guess. Better yet, make a parade out of it. His long-winded introduction to the Smyrnians includes such personal attributes as being, and I quote, mercifully endowed with every spiritual gift, telling us that Ignatius was the total package. Letters were written, messengers were dispatched, and forgive my skepticism when I tell you that something resembling an orchestrated effort appears to have been underway on the world stage. I'm not saying he wasn't martyred, though maybe that is what I'm saying. I could go either way. Not like my personal conclusions change the facts, but look at me, I'm rambling again. My point is, Rome seemed determined to make a martyr out of him, if you get my drift. And as far as his fruit is concerned, I'm not impressed. One thing is for certain: his letters are of grave importance because they detail for us in unparalleled light the champion view of the early 2nd century. Nearly everyone seems to think his view is the correct view on the basis that it is the winning view, and also because he was martyred for committing himself to it. But since when was the road to Rome paved with the narrow way? His letters were chosen to survive because they serve as a disinformation campaign aimed at leading his readers away from Yahuwah's instructions in righteous living. While he himself was cast into the role of a Roman criminal, one needn't even read between the lines to see his ambition, which was to remove the Natsarim from the spotlight once and for all. So, quoting from him, "See that you all follow the bishop, even as Jesus Christus does the Father, and the presbytery as you would the apostles, and reverence the deacons as being the institution of God. Let no man do anything connected with the church without the bishop. Let that be deemed a proper Eucharist, which is administered either by the bishop or by one to whom he has entrusted it. Wherever the bishop shall appear, there let the multitude of the people also be, even as wherever Jesus Christus is, there is the Catholic Church. It is not lawful without the bishop either to baptize or to celebrate a love feast, but whatsoever he shall approve of, that is also pleasing to God, so that everything that is done may be secure and valid." And this would be to the Smyrnians, chapter 8, 1-2. Catholic is a Greek word meaning universal or all-inclusive. And as far as my knowledge goes, you have just been given the very first known reference to it, certainly the earliest surviving one that we can find. I'm not sure if he invented the word, but he is the earliest. Look, I am all for respecting the authority of a pastor or a bishop in any given ministry. Contempt or divisiveness is never okay, though we are also capable of voting with their feet, especially when the doctrines of men are being inserted by top brass. Asking for respect is not what Ignatius is doing, though. On closer inspection, Ignatius is wresting away the authority of Moshe, the prophets, and Yahushua HaMashiach. by inserting controllers into the situation. In introducing the all-inclusive Catholic Church, he was seeing to it that the Nazarene were illegitimized and tossed into the outer darkness of man's design, because in his words, without the authority of the bishop, God is not pleased, and we can do nada, not, nil, nothing. Here's another quote. Moreover, I urge you to do nothing in a spirit of contentiousness, but in accordance with the teachings of Christ. For I heard some people say, if I do not find it in the archives, I do not believe it in the gospel. And when I said to them, it is written, they answered me, that is precisely the question. But for me, the archives are Jesus Christus. The unalterable archives are his cross and death and his resurrection and the faith that comes through him. By these things I want, through your prayers, to be justified. Philadelphians 8:2. Contextually speaking, there is the Jew tax. Admit it. Ignatius's desperate attempt to separate from the Torah makes a whole lot more sense now that the Jew tax sprang up. Ignatius wanted a total severing of the Gospels from the Torah in stating that the only unalterable archives are the cross, the death, the resurrection of Jesus Christus, and faith in his accomplishment. Everything else can go. Ignatius has just given us a confession. The universal church, which he was actively seeking to promote on his 08 martyrdom tour, held an image of a Christ which did not line up with the Hebrew Mashiach. The Hebrew Mashiach most certainly agreed with the Torah of Moshe, as well as the prophets, what Ignatius deemed by deductive reasoning the alterable archives. Of course, Yahushua Mashiach got pissed at the Pharisees for altering the archives. And yet here we have contentious spirits, as Ignatius calls them, who had the audacity to insist that the gospel message needed to line up with the aforesaid. Oh, how dare they? FYI, aside from their obvious Berean credentials, always seeking out the scripture to test a self-declared prophet's words, the Natsarim have just been identified. Quick review. They are the ones who applied Revelation 14:12 to their daily regimen in following the commands and the testimony of Yahushua HaMashiach. It's not too complicated, because severing one from the other was an unthinkable prospect. If not them, then what other people group could possibly be in contention with his bishop's circuit? Let's keep reading to see if the Natsarim thesis is a correct one. Here's another quote from Magnesians, chapter 8. Do not be deceived by strange doctrines or antiquated myths, ouch, since they are worthless. For if we continue to live in accordance with Judaism, I feel like there's like a lightning bolt going to come down just reading this stuff. We admit that we have not received grace. For the most godly prophets lived in accordance with Christus Jesus, which is true. They lived in accordance with Yahushua HaMashiach, but not the lawless Greek Christus Jesus. Continuing, this is why they were persecuted. Oh, do tell. Being inspired as they were by his grace, in order that those who are disobedient might be fully convinced that there is one God who revealed himself through Jesus Christus, his son. You see what he's doing here? He's saying, look, I'm being persecuted because I did away with the Torah. See, I'm being persecuted for that. And look at all the Natsarim over here who aren't going on their parade route to Rome right now. That's essentially what he's stating here. Did Ignatius just insinuate that the Torah and the Tanakh were filled with quote unquote strange doctrines and antiquated myths? He did. He also called the the instructions contained within them worthless. By the way, that's one way to end a losing argument, I suppose. He then goes on to rant about the most righteous prophets being those who lived in accordance with his version of Jesus Christus. And obviously, Jesus Christus was far too Greek to be blackmailed with the Jew tax. LOL. Who are these less righteous prophets that he mentions exactly? And can they be located in the Bible? If I'm adequately understanding his argument, the less righteous are the ones who lived according to Judaism, apparently. Moses, Mount Sinai, the covenant, keeping the feast, observing the weekly Sabbath, eating clean, Jew tax stuff. I could just imagine, an official coming along and looking at your plate in a restaurant and going, there's not enough bacon on that. We might have to Jew tax you. He even has the tenacity to claim the true prophets were persecuted on the basis that they did not live in accordance with the Natsarim mentality. Ridiculous. That's some grade A gaslighting right there. Another quote. If therefore those who were brought up in the ancient order of things have come to the possession of a new hope, no longer observing the Sabbath. You see, we have a new hope because we don't have to keep the Sabbath anymore. It's so dreadful that, just slave-inducing Sabbath day where you get to not work and rest. But living in the observance of the Lord's day, on which also our life has sprung up again by him and by his death. Chapter and verse, please. Chapter and verse. Whom some deny, by which mystery we have obtained faith. Some deny this, of course. And therefore endure that we may be found the disciples of Jesus Christus, our only master. How shall we be able to live apart from him, whose disciples the prophets themselves in the Spirit did wait for him as their teacher? And therefore he whom they rightly waited for, having come, raised them from the dead. Magnesians chapter 9. It really is rather embarrassing, his total lack of education concerning Yahuwah's instructions in righteous living. He has never attended the synagogue on Sabbath for a single day of his life, from what I can tell. I should have actually asked that as a question and then don't answer it. I mean, his disdain I get. The contemptuous behavior, which he claims of those who keep the commands, is really just a projection of himself, his own contempt. He is the one being contemptuous towards Yahuwah, the Elohim of Yasharel, and in turn, Yahushua HaMashiach, not those who are being obedient to the instructions. The ones who are being obedient to the instructions are not being contemptuous towards him. And we're going to see that later on with Polycarp's letter, his rebuttal. Many Christians share Ignatius's thoughts on this one, by the way. But then to repeatedly claim as his thesis that all true prophets sat around waiting to be instructed by Mashiach because they had no good instructions in front of them, none whatsoever, but just worthless mysteries. And a Mashiach who wouldn't be born for many centuries to come because the instructions which Yahuwah had delivered to them on Sinai were, again, worthless, antiquated myths, strange doctrines, blah, 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 and bonk, is cringeworthy at best. Of course, this is the sermon you probably heard from the pulpit at one time in your life. Why not just be honest and claim the Elohim of Yasharel was the demiurge of Platonism? Because a lot of people are, at least they're being honest with themselves, and therefore not to be listened to because that's what the Gnostics were already claiming. There were already Gnostics going around claiming not to listen to the Old Testament because it's the demiurge. It seems to me that a person would have better things to do with their life than become a prophet of Yahuwah if they thought that way, if they thought that everything that Moses had given them on Mount Sinai was worthless. Why even bother? Just go live your life in some other religion. Become a prophet of, the oracles of Delphi or something. Well, apparently the only prophets who were raised from the dead were those who disobeyed the Torah, according to Ignatius, thereby evading any potential Jew tax in the resurrection. Yes, you heard him right. He just said the resurrection had already happened. More 70 AD propaganda, no doubt. Apparently, those who were taken at Yahushua's glorious appearing over Jerusalem wore their Sunday best rather than their Sabbath tzitzit. They chose the mark of the beast rather than the mark of Yah, and were promptly resurrected along with the lawless prophets. LOL, LOL, LOL. Oh, here's another quote from him. Therefore, having become his disciples, let us learn to live in accordance with Christianity. For whoever is called by any other name than this does not belong to God. Throw out, therefore, the bad yeast, which has become stale and sour, and reach for the new yeast, which is Jesus Christus. Be salted with him, so that none of you become rotten, for by your odor you will be convicted. It is utterly absurd to profess Jesus Christus and to practice Judaism. For Christianity did not believe in Judaism, but Judaism in Christianity, in which every tongue believed and was brought together to God. Magnesians chapter 10. Ignatius may have been the first to coin the phrase Catholic, though the term Christian predates him, appearing once in the Bible. It can be found in Nazarene, that would be Acts 11:26. I will let you look that passage up. Not surprisingly, the original Christians sprang up from Antioch, the city which Ignatius claimed his own. Actually, now that I think about it, I probably should show it to you for discussion purposes. This is what we read in Acts. And when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. So it was that for a whole year they assembled with the church and taught a great many people. And the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. Simple deductive reasoning tells us that the Torah observant believers of Jerusalem were not Christians. Certainly it was not a title which they invented, and it is indeed questionable whether or not they would agree to the banner during the remaining decades of their lifetime. If the Torah observant believers of Jerusalem went by any name aside from the Natsarim, it was the way. That is a long-winded discussion best reserved for another paper, which I haven't gotten around to writing yet. And so I will let you look up those references for yourself on this go around. You can see all the numbers right there. Oh, and don't forget to do a study on the way of Yahuwah in the Torah and the Tanakh while you're at it, because that is undoubtedly what they were referring to. The way of Yahuwah is the Torah. In other news, Yochanan was all about the Torah. He even defined sin as a transgression of the Torah in 1 John 3:4-6. Explain to me again how this guy was a disciple of Yochanan, Ignatius. Time and again, he comes across like a disciple of Paul, though I cringe even making that loose connection. Look, I totally get it. I get why the Nazarene mentally, the current Nazarene mentality is to toss Paul to the curb. Though in my investigation, I have found, some people disagree with me, but I personally believe that the first couple centuries of the Nazarene, they were very pro-Paul. Many of them, maybe not all. Supposing he fails to pass the Deuteronomy 13 test, Paul, then they have every right to do so, toss him to the curb. That's their perfect right. Anyone who fails the Deuteronomy 13 test does not line up. You don't have to listen to their teachings. The Bible gives you that authority to do that. Yahushua HaMashiach is our exclusive authority. And of course, I believe Yahushua HaMashiach is Yahuwah, the son of Allah Hayam. His words are deemed true and are in total accordance with the Torah. Because, of course, everything that he said, he learned from his father. I personally believe Paul fell in agreement with the Torah as well, but guys like Ignatius certainly aren't helping. Paul was his boy. Whether Christians started out as Torah observant or lawless in Antioch is anybody's guess. Actually, I came to find later on in this research, you'll see that Antioch remained Nazarene territory into the 4th century. But one thing remains certain. Ignatius helped to define the spirit of Christianity as it appears to us today, which is a total severing from the very religion that it claims to springboard off of. It is a purposeful infiltration of one synchronistic and comprehensive visionary book, the Bible, whereby they twisted and contorted several letters at the end and told everyone not to be obedient to the commands which preceded it. I mean, I would say they're telling you to be disobedient to 100% of the Bible, but even if I give Paul, the Paul boys the benefit of the doubt, fine. Let's just disprove 95% of the Bible. Let's say that it's no longer applicable to our lives. The rebellious, sinful hearts have been making tasks such as what I've just described easy. But then there is the issue of beguiling one's audience, keeping them ignorant, which Ignatius happens to be doing. I would say, if only they knew, though the ultimate issue seems to be one of, if only they wanted to know. All right, well, here's another quote from Ignatius. Stay away from the evil plants. I wonder what the evil plants are. We could all guess. Which are not cultivated by Jesus Christus. You see what he did there? Another play on words. Because they are not the Father's planting. Not that I found any division among you. Instead, I found that there had been a purification. For all those who belong to God and Jesus Christus are with the bishops. And all those who repent and enter into the unity of the church will belong to God, so that they may be living in accordance with Jesus Christus. You see what he just did there? He just said that if you disagree with my circuit of bishops that I'm putting up that are all Torahless, you are not repenting. Repenting of what? They want you to repent of being obedient. So if you're actually repenting of your sins, you can't go to these bishops, because now you're a Judaizer and now you are not living in accordance with their version of Jesus Christus. Do not be misled, my brothers and sisters. If any follow a schismatic, they will not inherit the kingdom of God. If any hold to alien views, they disassociate themselves from the passion. Philadelphians 3:1-3. Evil plants, A cleverly spun pun, Those evil plants wouldn't happen to be the branches, would they? Well, apparently we are supposed to stay away from them, the evil plants, because the writers of Scripture and those who follow the instructions laid out by the Alahayam of Yasharel are being schismatic again, holding alien views to their usurpers. Don't you just love it, how the good guys always end up being the victors in the history books? It happens like that every time. It's amazing. All right, well, let's move on. Oh, this is where it starts getting really good tonight. The Natsarim, Polycarp, and the Quarto-Deciman controversy. I'll say that again. The Natsarim, Polycarp, and the Quarto-Deciman controversy. A raise of hands. Who else is bothered by the fact that Ignatius wrote a letter to Polycarp of Smyrna? I know I am. Or rather have been for a great many years. No longer, though. Polycarp was, by all indications, a disciple of Yochanan the Apostle. Do I need to write a line-for-line commentary on 1 John? Don't make me do it. Yahusha's Talmud, those would be his disciple, was Torah to the bone. I should say epistle there. I'm sorry. I miswrote that. Yahusha's... No, that is correct. Yahusha's Talmud, his disciple, Yochanan, was Torah to the bone, which raises the next set of questions. Was Polycarp Natsarim, or wasn't he? And if not, how far has the grape fallen from the cluster? Well, you'd be happy to learn that I decided to do some detective work and didn't come up for air empty-handed. You will hear what I've learned, but first, there is the issue of Ignatius's letter. Many suspect it was his last one before reaching Rome. I didn't quote from it. Though had I done so, you would see that his Judaizer talk has suddenly fallen by the wayside, choosing rather to slather his papyrus with honey and butter. It Ignatius was in the precarious position to write Polycarp, the last documented disciple of an apostle of Mashiach. He needed to select his words very carefully, refraining from anything which would condemn Yochanan's teachings, while still coming across as Polycarp's spiritual equal, if not his superior, which he kind of does in there. And above all else, he desperately sought his help. Oh, fine. How about I just quote from a section? And this is what he says to Polycarp. Chapter 7, it looks like. Seeing that the church which is at Antioch in Syria is, as report has informed me, at peace, through your prayers I also am the more encouraged, resting without anxiety in God, if indeed by means of suffering I may attain to God, so that through your prayers I may be found a disciple of Christ. It is fitting, O Polycarp, most blessed in God, to assemble a very solemn council and to elect one whom you greatly love and know to be a man of activity, who may be designated the messenger of God, and to bestow on him this honor that he may go into Syria and glorify your ever active love to the praise of Christ. A Christian has not power over himself, but must always be ready for the service of God. Which is a little strange there that he says that, yet he condemns those who are actually obedient, but we'll let that slide for the moment. Now this work is both God's and yours when you shall have completed it to his glory. For I trust that through grace you are prepared for every good work pertaining to God. Knowing therefore your energetic love for the truth, I have exhorted you by this brief epistle, inasmuch as I have not been able to write to all the churches, because I must suddenly sail from Troas to Neapolis, as the will of the emperor enjoins. I beg that you, as being acquainted with the purpose of God, will write to the adjacent churches, that they also may act in like manner, such as are able to do so, sending messengers, and the others transmitting letters through those persons who are sent by you, that you may be glorified by a work which shall be remembered forever, as indeed you are worthy to be. Polycarp 7, chapter 7 through 8, verse 1. So anyways, gone is the Judaizer talk from the Ignatius that we have come to know, replacing that as an exhortation on the basis that Polycarp has such an energetic love for the truth, as he phrases it. That love of the truth is what I want to get to the bottom of. He even implores Polycarp to intercede for him in prayer so that he might be found a disciple of Mashiach. Interesting phrasing. The thought is that Ignatius is simply seeking the courage to go through with his martyrdom, but the underlying sentiments furthermore describes Polycarp as unparalleled in his familiarity with the purpose of God, being a disciple of Yochanan and all. Again, that is what I want to get to the bottom of. Was Polycarp's understanding of truth one which embraced the Father's commands, or was he scared away by the Jew tax? I would be remiss if I didn't mention Ignatius's promise. Polycarp would be henceforth remembered forever if he transmitted his letters through his personnel, ensuring that there were multiple copies out there. We have before us a 2nd century chain letter, LOL. By all indications, Polycarp went along with the scheme, regardless of how he may have felt about them. The irony being that the chain letter actually worked. It really did. I mean, we only know about Ignatius because of Polycarp's call to action. That's not entirely true. We would have known of the name, probably, but we would have had nothing by him. And come to think of it, we wouldn't even have a single written word from Polycarp had it not been for his response letter, which was probably included in the bundle of Ignatius's letters. It was selected and chosen. I would imagine among his many correspondences that his other letters were far more inspired, as this one was likely written in haste. I will be sure to highlight the specifics of what is contained within a little later down the turnpike, because when I do, you will see that he not only believed in the coming millennial reign of Mashiach, but also the very idea of a physical 1,000-year kingdom was almost exclusively, and I should say exclusively, but we'll give the benefit of the doubt, almost exclusively a Nazarene one. No time for that now. We are still attempting to wrestle with Ignatius's hatred of Torah obedience via the Natsarim and Polycarp's tolerance of him. Were they in league together? Well, I'd say no. Without going into another Bible study, Polycarp to the Philippians shares a common trait with Clement to the Corinthians, in that both he and Clement were attempting to unify everyone under Mashiach, not the bishops, but under Mashiach and the sacred scriptures, and to stop being divided over the teachings of Kepha versus Paul versus so-and-so. Polycarp in particular gives ample mention of Paul, including quotations, which is indeed stunning, seeing as how he too was a student of Yochanan, or he was the only student of Yochanan that we can really verify. Was he overcompensating given the circumstances? I have so many questions and little resolution, as I wasn't there and wouldn't know. If only someone were to arrive in my backyard with a time machine phone booth so that I could check on Polycarp's creds for myself. I'd like to go interview the guy. Until that happens, here are my thoughts on the matter. The context has Polycarp living in a time when those who walked out Yahuwah's commands were still hoping to unify the ecclesia, and were even doing so by example, even if the lawless and the Sabbath breakers were hell-bent on dividing them, blackmailing everyone who didn't go along with their schemes with the Judaizer propaganda. And this is amazing when you read Clement. It's the same thing. He's just like we're going to keep the commands, we're going to keep the Torah, but let's stop being divisive. Let's love each other. Thousands of years later, has anything changed? Well, consider the following. So I think I'm quoting from Polycarp now. Yeah, quoting from Polycarp. Pray for all the saints. Pray also for kings and potentates and princes, and for those that persecute and hate you, and for the enemies of the cross, that your fruit may be manifest to all, and that you may be perfect in him. What an amazing prayer. Both you and Ignatius wrote to me that if anyone went from this into Syria, he should carry your letter with him, which request I will attend to if I find a fitting opportunity, either personally or through some other acting for me, that your desire may be fulfilled. The epistles of Ignatius written by him to us, and all the rest of his epistles, which we have by us, we have sent to you as you requested. They are subjoined to this epistle, and by them you may be greatly profited, for they treat of faith and patience, and all things that tend to edification in our Adonai. Any more certain information you may have obtained respecting both Ignatius himself and those that were with him, have the goodness to make known to us. Polycarp, chapter 12. Before ending his letter with a special emphasis on Ignatius, notice how he makes the transition. Supposing you have taken the time to read his entire epistle, and I'll be going over more elements of it later tonight, we were earlier instructed to follow Mashiach's example, to restore those who were lost and never forsake an opportunity to do good, lest Yahuwah be blasphemed. This is Polycarp. Whereas now, we are to pray for all the saints, but also for the kings and the princes, particularly those that persecute and hate us, that our fruit may be manifest to all, and that we may be found perfect in him. When Yahushua was hung from the cross and the temple controllers worked up the crowd so that they heaped insults upon him, he prayed to the Father that he forgive them in their arrogance. This was the very heart of Polycarp. So again, notice the transition. He goes from stating that to talking about Ignatius and fulfilling his request. That still doesn't answer the question as to whether Polycarp was numbered among the Natsarim or not. I believe he was. Our one testament to his teachings may be included with the letters of a Sabbath breaker, a Catholic architect, and a Judaizer blackmailer, but that may all be by design. Misdirection from the controlled opposition department. Think of his countless other correspondences which did not make the cut. Supposing they had survived the purge, might they have directed us to a Torah-obedient Mashiach? I believe they would. You will tell me it's all wishful thinking and conjecture on my part. Perhaps so. It most certainly would have been had I not stumbled upon the Quartodeciman controversy. And now let's talk about that. The Quartodeciman controversy involves Irenaeus, of all people. To be clear, Irenaeus, who lived from 130 to 202, wasn't simply the missionary of Gaul, that would be modern-day France, and Bishop of Lyons, France. The city is still named Lyons to this day. No, Irenaeus happened to be Polycarp's pupil, and so follow the chain of events. Prior to his elevation to the Bishop of Rome, though the RCC lists him as Pope Victor I, Jewish quote-unquote feast-keeping had been tolerated by those actively seeking control of the ecclesia, but no longer. Victor I, who again, he's listed as a pope now, whose papacy is said to have lasted from 189 to 199, instituted Easter as the official celebration of Christ's resurrection. Not only that, but he also enforced a universal practice of fasting until the holy day. Now, that's a problem if you know your Torah. Correction. The Catholic Encyclopedia claims Easter regulations have existed at least from the time of Pope Sixtus, who ruled from 115 to 124, and that's Hadrian territory, as if the Sixtus in his name isn't suspicious or anything like that. Now, in doing so, he hoped to supersede the observance of Passover and unleavened bread, those icky pooey feast of Yahuwah found in the earlier pages of the Bible, thereby stamping out anyone who kept it. Now think about this, because Passover and unleavened bread often fell before Easter. So if you're going to mandate, if you want to remove it and keep people from having their unleavened bread, you mandate you give a mandatory fast. His gaze, so we're talking about Victor I. Victor I's gaze turned upon upon Polycrates, not Polycarp, but Polycrates, as the bishop of Ephesus. This is Natsarim territory still. Polycrates kept the feast. Praise Yah. That mightn't be a problem, except for the fact that Polycrates also appears to have been the leader of the eastern wing of the ecclesia, including the Church of Jerusalem. They all kept the feast. At the end of the 2nd century, the Pope of Rome hoped to make an example of him. Polycrates was given the sentence of excommunication. Oh dear. How do you suspect Victor I aimed to carry that one out from his make-believe church in Rome? I mean, one can only speculate how infiltrated the Nazarene would be at this point in his story for his ambition to be a success. I mean, clearly he knew he had plants everywhere. And at any rate, Irenaeus, disciple of Polycarp, writing from behind his pulpit on the other side of the world in Gaul, in France, nobody knew about this guy, decided to make to join the Quartodeciman controversy by jumping into the ring. But why would he? Because his mentor was a feast keeper. In his defense, Polycrates wrote a letter, and this is what he wrote. As for us, then, we scrupulously observe the exact day, right? The exact day the Passover falls on, neither adding nor taking away. You see what he just did there? He said he's not going to add nor take away to the Torah. For in Asia, great luminaries have gone to their rest, who shall rise again in the day of the coming of Yahuwah, when he cometh with glory from heaven and shall raise again all the saints. He's telling you that the saints that are going to be resurrected are those that keep the feast. That's what he just said right there. If you read this, and we're going to be covering more of this tonight. It's a Nazarene idea. I speak of Philip, one of the 12 apostles, who was laid to rest at Hierapolis, and his 2 daughters, who arrived at old age unmarried. His other daughter also, who passed her life under the influence of the Ruach HaKodesh and reposes at Ephesus. There's, of course, John, or Jan, moreover, who reclined on the Lord's bosom, or Adonai's bosom, and who became a priest wearing the mitre. and a witness and a teacher. He rests at Ephesus. Then this is where it shows that the whole tradition that Yochanan was a bishop of Antioch doesn't really pan out. He was, according to the earliest actual documentation of the people that knew him, he was a bishop of Ephesus. Then there is Polycarp, both bishop and martyr at Smyrna, and Thracius from Eumenia, both bishop and martyr, who rests at Smyrna. Why should I speak of Segerus, bishop and martyr, who rests at Laodicea, of the blessed Papirius, moreover, and of Melito, the eunuch, who performed all his actions under the influence of the Ruach HaKodesh, and lies at Sardis, awaiting the visitation from heaven, when he shall rise again from the dead. These all kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month, in accordance with the gospel, without ever deviating from it, but keeping to the rule of faith. And you notice there, he's trying to avoid the whole Judaizing claim by saying, look, guys, it's in the gospel. Okay, I'm just going by what the gospel tells me to do. Moreover, I also, Polycrates, who am the least of you all, which is funny because he's actually in control of the whole Eastern Church, in accordance with the tradition of my relatives, some of whom I have succeeded. 7 of my relatives were bishops, and I am the 8th. And my relatives always observe the day when the people put away the leaven. So he's keeping not just keeping Passover, but unleavened bread. I myself, brethren, I say, who am 65 years old in the Lord, and have fallen in with the brethren in all parts of the world, and have read through all Holy Scripture, am not frightened at the things which are said to terrify us. For those who are greater than I have said, we sought to obey Allahayam rather than men. What a beautiful letter. I might also have made mention of the bishops associated with me, whom it was your own desire to have called together by me, and I called them together, whose names, if I were to write them down, would mount to a great number. These bishops, on coming to see me, unworthy as I am, signified their united approval of the letter, knowing that I wrote these gray hairs not in vain, but have always regulated my conduct in obedience to Adonai Jesus, Polycrates. So let me see if I got this right. Philip the Apostle and founder of the Eastern Orthodox Church, of course, Andrew is also founder, kept the feast. His 2 virgin daughters, as well as his other married daughter, kept the feast. Yochanan the apostle kept the feast. But then there he is, Polycarp, the Judaizer. He too kept the feast. Not to mention guys named Thracius, Segerus, Papirius, Melito, a succession of bishops and relatives, and a host of contemporary bishops, far too great a number to write down onto paper. They all kept the feast on the days that they actually landed upon rather than Sunday observance. Call it a wild hunch, but do you suppose they kept Sabbath as well? I'm sure it's all a coincidence that the Jerusalem Church kept the feast as well. Oh, I'm sure Pope Victor I didn't have control of Jerusalem on his mind when demanding that the entire world go lawless. All right, Polycarp and the Millennial Kingdom. Polycarp was Natsarim. The matter has been settled in my book. But then, did you know that Polycarp was also an instigator of the Millennial Kingdom? We're talking a physical 1,000-year reign of Mashiach, a literal manifestation of his kingdom upon the earth. Makes sense, seeing as how Yochanan was the one to describe the events in Revelation, and Polycarp was a disciple of his. No, I can't outright prove this to be the case with his one solitary letter. You will have to read my report all the way to the end to see why I've come to my conclusion. There are ample clues, however, to his epistle to the Philippians, by which I will now turn to. Therefore, prepare for action and serve God in fear and truth, leaving behind the empty and meaningless talk and the error of the crowd. Isn't that kind of interesting how he flips this? Where Ignatius is like, the crowd needs to go, you need to listen to the bishops. And he's kind of like, well, let's avoid the error of the crowd here. And believing in the one who raised our Adonai, Jesus Christus, from the dead and gave him glory and a throne at his right hand, to him all things in heaven and on earth were subjected, whom every breathing creature serves, who is coming as judge of the living and the dead, for whose blood God will hold responsible those who disobey him. But the one who raised him from the dead will raise us also, if, conditionally, we do his will and follow his commandments and love the things he loved, while avoiding every kind of unrighteousness, greed, love of money, slander, and false testimony, not repaying evil for evil or insult for insult or blow for blow or curse for curse, but instead remembering what Adonai said as he taught, do not judge so that you may not be judged. Forgive and you will be forgiven. Show mercy so that you may be shown mercy. With the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And blessed are the poor and those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of Elohim. Polycarp to the Philippians 2. The present teaching doesn't outright say there will be a physical kingdom upon the earth, though if you keep reading through to the end, you can see Polycarp's understanding of the kingdom as one in which the dead would need to be raised into. Mostly, I wanted to establish Polycarp's creds, being a Judaizer and all. His deduction is that our Father in heaven raised Yahushua HaMashiach from the dead because he was obedient to his commands. Therefore, we too can share that same promise if, conditionally, we follow his commandments. Loving the things that Mashiach loved is just a discrete way of saying Yahushua loved Jewish things and was therefore taxable, rather than indulging in Nimrodic holidays like Sol Invictus and Easter. Chapter 5 of his book. Knowing, therefore, that God is not mocked, we ought to live in a manner that is worthy of his commandment and glory. Similarly, deacons must be blameless in the presence of his righteousness, as servants of God and Christ and not of people. They must not be slanderers, not insincere, not lovers of money, but self-controlled in every respect, compassionate, diligent, acting in accordance with the truth of Adonai, who became a servant of all. If we please him in this present world, we will receive the world to come as well, inasmuch as he promised that he will raise us from the dead, and that if we prove to be citizens worthy of him, we will also reign with him, if that is, we continue to believe. Polycarp to the Philippians, chapter 5. And there it is. Revelation 14:12. The entire Natsarim worldview in a nutshell. Belief in Yahushua and serving Elohim via obedience to the Father's commands cannot be severed from the other in this present world. To do so is to jeopardize our being resurrected from the dead into the world to come, wherein we might reign with him. If Polycarp was being discreet, it's likely because he knew that his letter would go out to the Natsarim as well as the Torah haters. Lest we forget, it was written half a century after the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, and yet neither he nor Yochanan had received the memo. Chapter 7 from his letter. Not confess that Jesus Christus has come in the flesh as Antichrist. That's a direct quote from his teacher, Yochanan. And whoever does not acknowledge the testimony of the cross is of the devil. And whoever twists the sayings of Adonai to suit his own sinful desires, that's interesting. You twist it so you could suit what is your sinful desires? Well, to give permission to be disobedient. That's the only way to do it. And claims that there is neither resurrection nor judgment. Well, that person is the firstborn of Satan. Therefore, let us leave behind the worthless speculation of the crowd and their false teachings. What? There's actually a crowd that's forming that's giving false teachings about Jesus Christus. And let us return, mind you, not to the bishops, to the word delivered to us from the beginning. Polycarp to the Philippians 7. Is this not an amazing letter? You might be asking yourself, how is the resurrection and judgment tied in with people twisting the sayings of Adonai so as to suit their own sinful desire? Well, I think the answer has much to do with his following quip regarding the worthless speculation of the crowd and their false teachings. He's not referring to the goyim when in fact the ecclesia is his concern. Already they had strayed from the way. They were embracing false teachings because they were not turning to the word delivered from the very beginning. Wait, what beginning? That's a reference to Bereshith, Genesis. He's telling us to go back to the beginning of the book and start there, seeking instruction. That's the way. The warning is not so dissimilar from the one Kepha gave in regard to those who would twist Paul's confused writings so as to justify a lifestyle of lawlessness. That would be Torah transgression, thereby leading to their own destruction. Similarly, the sayings of Mashiach were being twisted in such a way that they were endangering their own resurrection in the world to come. Amazing, since he is addressing the reported martyrdom of Ignatius, the Jew hater. And if I had to guess, the worldview of Augustine was already being developed by his controllers, wherein the kingdom was spiritual, only spiritual, and Rome was it. Another quote, Polycarp, chapter 7. Hold on, let me pour a little bit more coffee here. I hope you guys are enjoying this. All of you be subject to one another. Well, that's kind of interesting. That's completely different phrasing than being subject to the Catholic bishops. All of you be subject to one another and maintain an irreproachable standard of conduct among the Gentiles. That's a workspace thing, an action, so that you may be praised for your good deeds and Adonai may not be blasphemed because of you. Polycarp, chapter 7. Admit it. Half of you didn't believe me when I said Polycarp wasn't goy, did you? Well, he wasn't. Goy sounds a lot like gay, by the way, which is how many of the goy actually like it. Have you seen the state of the goy church as of late? And of course, goy means Gentile, in case you're confused. In saying we should be subject to one another so as to maintain an irreproachable standard of conduct among the goyim, he was referring to Yasharel. The Alexandrian school, how do you pronounce that? Catechetical, I don't know. We'll just call it the Alexandrian school because that's where it was based, which I'm about to turn to, developed a theological system whereby they could remain goy, choosing the seat of Esau rather than Yasharel, but not Polycarp. Polycarp was educated by Yochanan the Apostle and knew better. Being praised for good deeds is the same thing as not blaspheming Yahuwah, which, by the way, is basically a direct quote from Leviticus 22:31. I'm about to turn there as well. Polycarp knew all about that one, obviously, because he turned to the word delivered from the beginning, and he read through the way, not turning to the left or right. Polycarp chapter 7 says this: anyone who does not avoid love of money will be polluted by idolatry and will be judged as one of the Gentiles who are ignorant of Adonai's judgment. What? Or do we not know that the saints will judge the world as Paul teaches? Not a fluke. The goyim are the ones being judged, telling us that the one cannot be truly set apart unless they cross over to Yasharel, as it is only the resurrected children of Yasharel who will reign with Mashiach and serve as judges in the world to come. All right, well, let's talk about the Natsarim and Yasharel and his story. Does anyone else find it slightly odd that the apostles were Hebrew, the earliest followers of Mashiach were Hebrew, the Goyim became Hebrew on the basis that grafting into Yasharel was a key component of being Natsarim, but that the church fathers, as we like to call them, that's probably how they like to be called, were by habit either Greek or Roman and not Hebrew? call it a hunch, but I'm thinking there was a flip of the script somewhere along the winding road. As it happens, nearly the entirety of our Greco-Roman fathers also just so happened to be educated at the Alexandrian school. Its other competitor would be the school of Antioch, and we already know about its famed alumni, or its famed alumnus specifically, Ignatius. According to Jerome, the Alexandrian school was founded by Iochanan Marcus. That would be John Mark, the apostle, Kepha's right-hand man with the plan, which I highly doubt. So the writer of Bizora Marcus ended up in Alexandria. Whoop-de-doo. We all know that. I seem to recall there was a lot of running and screaming and hiding during Nero's reign of terror. Not exactly the brightest hour for establishing a university. It is only a little suspicious that we have no actual records. The earliest recorded dean was supposedly a guy named Athenagoras in 176, well over 100 years after the fig tree generation. He was succeeded by somebody named Pantanus in 181, but then his successor you've likely heard of, Clement of Alexandria. Now, here's all the guys we're going to be talking about right here. You can look at their pretty portraits, all coming from that school pretty much. Clement of Alexandria, not to be confused with the first century Clement of Rome. Please don't confuse the two. He became dean in 190, which just so happens to be the year that many theorize the school actually started. It probably did start in that year. They're all trying to find their roots in the traditions of the apostles. So if you can do that, then you legitimize your lawlessness, right? Take a mental note of that. Other notable theologians with a connection to the school include Origen, Gregory, Thalmet, I can't pronounce that. It was Gregory, Pope Heracles, Dionysius the Great, and Didymus the Blind. Jerome and Basil were certainly no strangers to the school, and as you will recall, Jerome is the one who claimed John Mark was the founder. Now, I'm not interested in villainizing every member of the faculty. I want you guys to know that. A guilt by association sort of thing. We are all wrong about a doctrine or two, which is being kind, and I am certainly no exception to the rule. I mean, I disagree with myself more often than probably other people disagree with me. I'm sure the graduates of the Alexandrian school have had many splendid things to say over the centuries. In past papers, I have quoted from them, and I expect to be a repeat offender. I happen to like much of what Origen has to offer. Much, not all. You guys can say the same thing about me. How we judge an individual is not necessarily based upon rightness or wrongness, but the content of their character. Not that I'm shying away from or snubbing the Sabbath either, which just so happens to be the mark of Yahweh, the Elohim of Yasharel. That being said, there is a common trait among the church fathers: condemnation of anything which might fall under the prior Jew tax and the Natsarim. These are the same individuals who labored to retain Ignatius's vision for a Catholicism severed from the Torah of Yahweh. They retained their identity as Greeks, choosing to be grafted into a Goyim congregation rather than a Hebrew one. How many Christians today will proudly proclaim themselves to be a Gentile? They'll be like, I'm not Israel, I'm the Gentile church. That's not good. In their arrogance, they're claiming they're not yet grafted into the Yasharel tree. When it comes to ditching obedience to the commands, I have come to find there is no shortage of excuses. The most common one being that the rules needn't be kept if they can be classified as Jewish. I mean, you've all heard this before. Supposing you find yourself trapped in Torah observance, supposing you don't like obedience or even the face of our Heavenly Father, which the instructions in righteous living mirror, then don't worry. Another exit, complete with excuses and justification, will come along shortly. I'm saying for all of you who are currently obeying the Torah, you're keeping commands, you don't like it because it actually reflects the actual face of the Father. You it's like getting to heaven and go, yeah, I really don't like it here. It's not what I thought it would be. Don't worry. There's another exit door coming along shortly. Case in point, I offer the court as well as the jury Tertullian for evidence. Tertullian, aka Quintus Septimius Florens Tertullianus, was born in 155 and died in 220, designating him as one of our earlier church fathers on the timetable. I had asked you to bookmark Clement's deanship in 190. They were contemporaries. Clement died in Jerusalem in 215, just 5 years before Tertullian, meaning that they, died 5 years apart. He also hearkened from Carthage, which, like neighboring Alexandria, was a landmark Roman province in northern Africa. Well, in his book, Adversus Judaeus, Tertullian reviled the Yahudim, the Jews, for their apparent failure to understand the scriptures in the way that he did. Because, of course, he's translating it from Paul looking back, not from the beginning looking forward to Paul. After letting his reader know of a recent dispute between a Christian and a Yahud proselyte, this is his immediate response. So this is Tertullian speaking now. For the occasion, indeed, of claiming divine grace even for the Gentiles derived a preeminent fitness from this fact that the man who set up to vindicate God's law as his own was of the Gentiles and not a Jew of the stock of the Israelites. For this fact that Gentiles are admissible to God's law, it's like admissible in court, right? It's not going. He's saying the Torah is not going to apply to you in court. Is enough to prevent Israel from priding himself on the notion that the Gentiles are accounted as a little drop of a bucket or else as dust out of a threshing floor, although we have God himself as an adequate engager and faithful promiser, and that he promised to Abraham that in his seed should be blessed all nations of the earth, and that out of the womb of Rebekah 2 peoples and 2 nations were about to proceed, of course, those of the Jews, that is, of Israel, and of the Gentiles, that is ours. Each then was called a people and a nation, lest from the non-cupative appellation any should dare to claim for himself the privilege of grace. For God ordained 2 peoples and 2 nations as about to proceed out of the womb of one woman. As early as the 2nd century, it is quite apparent that the church fathers were attempting to steer the ship in a direction which would have them remain in the people group of their birth rather than crossing over if it entailed being grafted into Yasharel. Wait a second. Back up the neighborhood of make-believe trolley. Did Tertullian just claim Rivka or Rebecca had 2 sons and that we are to identify as one of them? If I'm not mistaken, their names were Yaakov and Esau. Yaakov would be Jacob in modern terms if you need help in the identification process, and he went on to become Yasharel. The Natsarim are grafted into him, Yasharel. But then in the world of checkerboard duality, black and white, that is who Tertullian does not want to be grafted into, Yasharel. His claim is that Esau is the heritage of the ecclesia and that he is good enough, Esau. Do we need brushing up on our prophets? Let's see what we can read here in, let's see, what is this? This is Malachi. How often do we read from Malachi? The burden of the word of Yahweh to El Yasharel by Malachi. I have loved you, says Yahweh. Yet ye say, how did you love us? Wasn't Esau Yaakov's brother? Declares Yahweh. I loved Yaakov, but Esau I hated. I turned his mountains into a wasteland and left his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness. The descendants of Esau may say, we have been beaten down, but we will rebuild the ruins. Yet this is what Yahweh Sevaoth says, they may rebuild, but I will tear it down. They will be called the wicked land, and the people with whom Yahweh is always angry. Malachi chapter 1, 1-4. Yahweh loved Yasharel, whereas Esau he hated. It says he turned their heritage into a waste for the dragons of the wilderness. I have a paper on that one, It's called Wastelands of the Seraphim. And though they promised to rebuild, Yahweh assured Yasharel that they would always be called the wicked land. that he would always be a people Esau, would always be a people with whom he was angry with, and that he would beat down whatever they attempted to rebuild. Yeah, I would say Esau is not the goy who we should be modeling ourselves after. Those of you who have read my Bezorah Kefa Gospel of Peter commentary have been made well aware that Esau was Edom. The Herods were Edomites. And well, guess what? The temple controllers were as well. Yahusha acknowledged that they were children of Abraham, but then called them the seeds of Satan. That's not a good look. These were the same Edomites who fulfilled the Genesis 3 prophecy in crucifying the son of Allahayam, son of God, just as Esau wanted to reverse engineer the prophecy when attempting to crush Yaakov's head in the womb, Yasharel's head. And this is the guy who Tertullian is trying to model himself after. Give it a read. I furthermore showed how the Edomites were identified with Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, the same Romans whom Tertullian was hoping to speak for. Yeah, no, none of this is good. Don't be an Esau. Just don't. Say no to drugs, pharmakia, and Esau. Some centuries later, Islam would identify Ishmael as their boy rather than Yitzhak, his brother. Ishmael was Abraham's fleshly son through Hagar rather than the promised seed through Sarah. What is this theme I'm detecting? Why is everyone so bent out of shape regarding their being grafted into Yasharel? Do we need to do a little polishing up on Paul's letters? And this is what he says. But as some of the branches were broken off, there's the Natsarim again, the branches. And you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree. Do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if Allahayam did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of Allahayam, severity toward those who have fallen, but Allahayam's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For Allahayam has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? Romans chapter 11. Really, you should read the entire chapter. Paul is speaking of the mystery regarding Yasharel's salvation, not Esau's. And he is writing to the Romans, ironically, telling them that they are a wild olive tree which can be grafted into the cultivated olive tree. Paul is referencing Ezekiel chapter 17, wherein Yehuda and Ephraim were two sticks that were promised to eternally become one, hence a grafting, the Natsarim. There's no mixing of fruit here. You can't graft an apple branch into a plum tree. The analogy of a better Goyim ecclesia, completely separate from the ecclesia established at Sinai, falls flat when we recognize that only olive trees are being discussed, a wild and a cultivated one. Getting back to Tertullian, I have quoted for you chapter 1 of his book, in which he insists we identify with Esau rather than Yasharel. In chapter 2, he makes the following assertion. For in this law given to Adam, we recognize in embryo all the precepts which afterwards sprouted forth when given through Moses. That is, you shall love the Lord your God from your whole heart and out of your whole soul. You shall love your neighbors yourself. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. False witness you shall not utter. Honor your father and mother. And that which is another shall you not covet. For the primordial law was given to Adam and Eve in paradise as the womb of all the precepts of God. An answer to the Jews too. In order to circumnavigate Yasharel as his identity, thereby evading the Jew tax, Tertullian creates a completely new theological term for the Ten Commandments. He calls it the primordial law, insisting that it existed in the paradise of Eden. Why am I feeling hungry for primordial soup all of a sudden? I'm assuming he would also assign the law of Christ into the same quote-unquote primordial law, and in part I happen to agree with him. The law is eternal. A covenant given to Abraham cannot be done away with, nor can the covenant given to Yasharel by which we are expected to be grafted in. And yes, the law happens to predate even the dawn of time. I just have one problem. Actually, I have two of them, not to mention 613 others. I numbered the laws on my fingers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, going all the way up, which Tertullian includes on his primordial list, and I'm only counting 8 of them, 8 out of 10, and there should be 10. So only 8 of the commands are eternal then, or primordial? Teach me, Tertullian. I want to learn. He conveniently left out the part regarding the Sabbath, no surprise there, and also not taking Yahweh's name in vain. That second omission might be a rookie mistake, though I'm thinking it's more of a Freudian slip, because how you do one thing is how you do everything, and allow me to demonstrate. And Yahweh, the ever-living, set forth words in order toward Al-Mashahad to declare, set forth words in order toward the sons of Yasharel. Okay, this comes from Leviticus chapter 23, or Yahkara'ah. Yahkara'ah, Leviticus 23, is the big, scary anthropological chapter regarding the 7 feasts of Yahweh. They are extensions of the Sabbath and are, in fact, referred to as high Sabbaths. Tax evaders love to classify them as Jewish feasts, their argument being that they don't have to participate in something that is Jewish, which the Jewish feasts happen to be, apparently. It's all misdirection, though. There are no Jewish feasts in the Torah. The Yahudim just so happen to be one tribe among 12, or 13 by some counts. Should I list the others off for you? The others are Reuben, Simon, Levi, Zebulun, Yishakar, Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Benjamin, and Yosef, or Benjamin, with Yosef and his sister Dinah being represented by Ephraim and Manasseh. Which gate will you be entering in New Jerusalem? Because there isn't a Goy or Esau option. You've got to choose one of those tribes. You have to be grafted into Israel. Well, continuing Leviticus chapter 22. And you shall guard my matzawath and fashion them. I am Yahweh, the ever-living. And you shall not profane my Kudash name. Kudash meaning set apart. You shall not profane my set apart name. But I will be regarded as Kudash, set apart in the midst of the sons of Yasharel. Only one chapter earlier, Yahuwah commands the sons of Yasharel not to profane his holy name. Well, that's interesting. And not simply because it's one of the 10. The context here pertains to his ordinances and precepts. Sin is a transgression of the Torah. Choosing disobedience rather than obedience is the same thing as profaning his name. It's why leaving off profaning the name from his primordial law, which again he made up, comes across like a natural domino effect, seeing as how the Sabbath is also being ignored. He's profaning the name of Yahweh. Come to think of it, he should have left off the part where it says, you shall love the Lord your God with your whole heart and out of your whole soul as well, because clearly Tertullian is only so willing to serve and sacrifice as an Edomite will allow for. More quotes from Tertullian. It follows accordingly that insofar as the abolition of carnal circumcision and of the old law is demonstrated as having been consummated at its specific times, so also the observance of the Sabbath is demonstrated to have been temporary. For the Jews say that from the beginning, God sanctified the seventh day by resting on it from all his works which he made, and that thence it was likewise that Moses said to the people, remember the day of the Sabbath to sanctify it. Every servile work you shall not do therein, except what pertains unto life. Whence we, Christians, understand that we still more ought to observe a Sabbath from all servile work always, and not only every seventh day, but through all time. And through this arises the question for us, what Sabbath God would willed us to keep? For the scriptures point to a Sabbath eternal and a Sabbath temporal. For Isaiah, the prophet says, your Sabbaths my soul hates. Christians love to quote that one. And in another place he says, my Sabbaths you have profaned. Whence we discern that the temporal Sabbath is human, and the eternal Sabbath is accounted divine, concerning which he predicts through Isaiah. And there shall be, he says, month after month, and day after day, and Sabbath after Sabbath, and all flesh shall come to adore in Jerusalem, says the Lord, which we understand to have been fulfilled in the times of Christ, when all flesh, that is, every nation, came to adore in Jerusalem God the Father through Jesus Christ, his Son, as was predicted through the prophet. Behold, proselytes through me shall go into you. Thus, therefore, before this temporal Sabbath, there was withal an eternal Sabbath foreshown and foretold. Just as before the carnal circumcision, there was withal a spiritual circumcision foreshown, an answer to the Jews too. You do realize that Tertullian is making this crap up, right? He's totally making it up. There is no such thing as a temporal Sabbath. It's another invented doctrine. Chapter and verse, please. Even more adorable is the part where he incites the prophet Yeshayahu, specifically the part where Yahuwah has said the sons of Yasharel were profaning his Sabbath. We have already seen in Leviticus 22 what that amounts to. Disobedience. Is the deduction being made that they were profaning his Sabbath in keeping it, and that Tertullian is actually doing everyone a favor in not keeping it, because if he did, he too would be profaning it? Is that what he is saying? To even suggest that they were being obedient to what Yahuwah ordained, and that the Alahayam of Yasharel then gaslit them into saying following his commands was akin to profaning the holy, makes my head hurt. And did Tertullian even appreciate the irony that Yahuwah has said they were his Sabbaths, which Yasharel is profaning? Not theirs, his, and not a temporal one. Looks like we got to clean up in the 2nd century. It's going to take more than a mop to absorb that diarrhea. Seriously, watching the church fathers justify the rebellion and make their arguments, claiming to be the sons of Edom, just outing themselves as the tares, is like watching a man drown in water. I would very much like to extend a hand and help him out of the mire, but I already know what will happen. He will call me baby booby names like Judaizer. Should you choose to read on, Tertullian agrees that the temporal Sabbath lands on the 7th day of the week, the day which Allahayam just so happened to rest on after creation, but then insists that Adam, Enoch, Abraham, and Melchizedek were all keeping the true Sabbath, the one which happened to land on Sunday rather than the fake temporal one. Oh, please, God, no, just make it stop. If I'm understanding Tertullian, Yahuwah instructed Moshe to have Yasharel keep a completely separate day from the heavenly one, which had apparently already been established on the first day of the week, just so that he can do away with the 7th-day Sabbath and prove the Torah keepers wrong when the Jew tax came along. Chalk it up to the existence of the Natsarim. That's what I've been trying to get at. More evidence of their existence in his story. When Tertullian reviled the Yahudim for their failure to understand the scriptures in the way that he did, was he in fact refuting Yahudim known to him, who in actuality understood what it meant to be grafted into Yasharel? Or put another way, do the accusations he makes against the Yahudim and their keeping the Sabbath give evidence of an ongoing debate within his community? Now, this seems like just as good a time as any to point out the 613. I was going to take you there tonight and demonstrate this. I'll have to do this another time for how long this is going. Anyways, the 613, it can be found on my website. You can see a picture of it there. You could take you to it really quickly right here. There it is. Boom. There it is. And it's an interactive tool which can be found on my website. It was designed by my wife, Sarah, and is intended for Wookiees and novices alike. Yahushua HaMashiach said the two greatest commands were loving Yah and loving your neighbor. The entire 10, as nearly everyone knows, can be divided into these two. But most don't realize is that the 613 commands of the Torah are descriptions of the 10 and the 2. In other words, If you want to know how to love Yahuwah and your neighbor, the two, then the Torah explains how. The 2 makes the 10. The Torah explains how. I suggest playing around with the 613 tool. Come over to my website. There's a link on there. Every single command falls under one of the 10, and they come complete with a chapter and verse, as well as the translation of your choice. Yasharel rules. Jumping over to Epiphanius, he was the bishop of Salamis, living between 320 through 403, and this is how he described the Natsarim. We shall now especially consider heretics who call themselves Nazarenes. They are mainly Jews and nothing else. They make use not only of the New Testament, but they also use in a way the Old Testament of the Jews, for they do not forbid the books of the law, the prophets, and the writings, so that they are approved of by the Jews, from whom the Nazarenes do not differ in anything. And they profess all the dogmas pertaining to the prescriptions of the law and to the customs of the Jews, except they believe in Messiah. They preach that there is but one God and his son, Yeshua, the Messiah. But they are very learned in the Hebrew language. See, he doesn't like that. For they, like the Jews, read the whole law, then the prophets. It's always amazing how the Torah haters, they don't like people who read from the Hebrew. It just irks them because they know that there's truth to be found there. They differ from the Jews because they believe in Messiah, and from the Christians in that they are to this day bound to the Jewish rites, such as circumcision, the Sabbath, and other ceremonies. They have the good news according to Matthew in its entirety in Hebrew. For it is clear that they still preserve this in the Hebrew alphabet as it was originally written. Wow, thanks for considering and thinking about us, Epiphanius, even if only to call us dirty, rotten heretics. Seriously, I'm digging every single description of the Natsarim as he dishes accusations our way. We not only make use of the New Testament, but also the Old Testament. Yes, the same books contained in the frontal lobe of our Bibles, the very books which the Jews read. Oh, the controversy. He also claims we don't forbid the Torah, the prophets, nor the writings from our daily regimen. Say it ain't so. You mean to say the fourth commandment still applies? Oh dear. And get this, we profess all the dogmas of the Torah, all 613, just as the Jews do, and yet still somehow manage to recognize Yahusha as Mashiach. Who would have ever thought that Mashiach was somehow, spoken about in the first 2/3 of the book? Maybe he was, and hang with me here, I know this is a wild out there thought, but maybe, just maybe, Moshe spoke of Yahusha because Yahusha was the author of the book. Now that Epiphanius has outed us as Bible believers from beginning to end, I just love that accusation. Let's turn to Jerome to see how he evaluates the situation. And this is what he says. The Natsarim are those who accept Messiah in such a way that they do not cease to observe the old law. Well, that wasn't so bad, was it? Though I am told he did not intend his critique kindly. Boo then. Boo to you too, Jerome. According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, the second phase of Easter implementation, we saw the first phase when Polycarp was outed as a Passover keeper. The second phase of Easter implementation occurred during the Council of Nicea in 325. The one that Santa Claus attended. He sees you when you're sleeping as well as when you're keeping Passover, apparently, knowing if you're naughty or nice and deserving of the old Jew tax. Also, yes, that is how they phrase it, as the second phase. Is there a playbook out there that I'm not aware of? They also refer to it as the Easter controversy because you so controversial for being obedient to Yahuwah rather than your Roman controllers. Well, the second phase is when Emperor Constantine threw up his glove into the ring. Nope, not a typo. The dude threw up. He spewed and vomited all over the set apart when penning his letter, letting everyone know, let everyone who decided to skip out on his elder meeting know what the new church policy was. Let me quote from his letter for you. The great grace of God's power has constantly been increasing, as is evident in the general prosperity of the empire. I, therefore, decided to make it my aim above all else that one faith, sincere love, and unvarying devotion to Almighty God be maintained among the most blessed assemblies of the Catholic Church. So here you see Ignatius's vision fully realized. But I perceive that this could only be established firmly and permanently when all of the bishops, or at least the greatest part, were convened in the same place for a council where they could discuss every point of our most holy religion. So we assembled as many as possible, and I myself was also present as one of you, for I will not deny what I especially rejoice in, that I am your fellow servant. All points were then minutely investigated. I'm questioning whether he even wrote this letter. Like, Constantine was makes me want to like roll my eyes that he's a fellow servant. Like, the dude wasn't even baptized to his deathbed. But anyways, until a decision was brought to light, which was found acceptable to him, who is the inspector of all things, and brought a unified agreement, leaving nothing which could cause dissension or controversy in matters of faith. So he doesn't want any controversy in matters of faith, no dissension. So what is that? What is the dissension and the controversy that he wants to end? Here it is. At the council, we also considered the issue of our holiest day, Easter, not Passover, Easter. And it was determined by common consent that everyone, everywhere, should celebrate it on one and the same day. For what can be more appropriate, or what more solemn, than that this feast from which we have received the hope of immortality, that's interesting, should be kept by all without variation, using the same order and a clear arrangement. And in the first place, it seemed very unworthy for us to keep this most sacred feast following the custom of the Jews. There it is. A people who have soiled their hands in a most terrible outrage and have thus polluted their souls and are now deservedly blind. So if you're a Natsarim, you are deservedly blind. Since we have cast aside their way of calculating the date of the festival, you get that? So we're not going to use the Bible anymore as our instructions. We can ensure that future generations can celebrate this observance at the more accurate time, which we have kept from the first day of the Passion until the present time. He will change the times. Therefore, have nothing in common with that most hostile people, the Jews. Have nothing in common with those Nazarene. Cast them out of your house. We have received another way from the Savior. In our holy religion, we have set before us a course which is both valid and accurate. Let us unanimously pursue this. Another way, which is a little creepy. Let us, most honored brothers, withdraw ourselves from that detestable association. It is truly most absurd for them to boast that we are incapable of rightly observing these things without their instruction. On what subject are they competent to form a correct judgment? Well, we just chapter and verse. We just read what it says. Who, after that murder of their Lord and patricide, lost their senses and are led not by any rational motive, but by an uncontrollable impulsiveness to wherever their innate theory may drive them. This is why even in this matter they do not perceive the truth, so that they constantly err in the utmost degree and will celebrate the feast of Passover a second time in the same year instead of making a suitable correction. Why then should we follow the example of those who are acknowledged to be infected with serious error? Surely we should never allow Easter to be kept twice in one and the same year. Oh no, we won't do that. But even if these considerations were not laid before you, you should still be careful, both by diligence and prayer, that your pure soul should have nothing in common, or even seem to do so, with the customs of men so utterly depraved. You get that? So the people keeping Passover are utterly depraved. This should also be considered. In a matter so important and of such religious significance, the slightest disagreement is most irreverent. For our Savior left us only one day to be observed in remembrance of our deliverance. That is the day of his most holy passion. He also wished his Catholic Church to be one, the members of which are still cared for by one Spirit, that is, by the will of God, however much they may be scattered in various places. Let the good sense consistent with your sacred character consider how grievous and inappropriate it is that on the same days some should be observing feast, while others are celebrating feast. And after the days of Easter, some should celebrate festivities and enjoyments, while others submit to appointed fastings. For this reason, divine providence directed that we put into effect an appropriate correction and establish uniformity of practice, as I suppose you are all aware. So first, it was desirable to change the situation so that we have nothing in common with the nation of father killers who slew their Lord. Second, the order which is observed by all the churches of the western, southern, and northern parts, and by some also in the eastern, is quite suitable. Therefore, at the current time, we all thought it was proper that you, intelligent as you are, would also cheerfully accept what is observed with such general unanimity, meaning you're unintelligent if you disagree. Because something might happen to you, something bad. It would be a shame if you would, I don't know, get a leg broken in the back alley or something. I don't know. Let's see. Unanimity of sentiment in the city of Rome. Got to agree with Rome. Throughout Italy, Africa, all Egypt, Spain, France, Britain, Libya, the whole of Greece, and the dioceses of Asia, Pontus, and Cilicia. I pledge myself that this solution would satisfy you after you carefully examined it, especially as I consider that not only are the majority of congregations located in the places just mentioned, but also that we all have a most sacred obligation to unite in desiring whatever common sense seems to demand and what has no association with the perjury of the Jews. But to sum up matters briefly, it was determined by common consent that the most holy festival of Easter should be solemnized on one and the same day, for it is not at all decent that there should be in such a sacred, serious matter any difference. It is quite commendable to adopt this option, which has nothing to do with any strange errors, nor deviates from what is right. Since these things are consistent, gladly receive this heavenly and truly divine command. For whatever is done in the sacred assemblies of the bishops can be traced to divine will. Therefore, once you have demonstrated the things which have been prescribed to all our beloved brothers, it would be good for you to make public the above written statements and to accept the reasoning which has proved itself to be sound, and to establish this observance of the most holy day. In this way, when I arrive to check on your condition, which I have desired earnestly for some time, I will be able to celebrate the sacred festival with you on one and the same day, and will rejoice with you for all things. Oh, gee, he gets to celebrate Mithras with you. How exciting. I can't wait. Show up at your church, Easter. Let's celebrate Mithras. As I see that through our efforts, divine power is frustrating Satan's cruelty, and that you're... he's frustrating Satan by doing away with the Passover and Sabbath. Can you believe that? And that your faith, peace, and unity are flourishing everywhere. May God preserve you, beloved brothers. Constantine, the Council of Nicea. Constantine ends his letter by stating that his doing away of the Passover is frustrating Satan, the accuser. LOL, 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 LOL. I would tell you to stop making me laugh if it wasn't so tragic. Having to read a declaration of freedom penned by the Antichrist, or excuse me, I meant Constantine, but not really. He doesn't outright say Natsarim when speaking of the Jews, but he might as well have. The declaration isn't intended for the biological Yahudim. It is clearly directed at the Passover keepers within the ecclesia. Those are the Jews that he's talking about, the ones who actually believe Yahushua's Mashiach, and they live according to the Old Testament. He even admits that the eastern leg of the church, which would be Antioch and Jerusalem, were still headed up by the Natsarim. It's there if you don't have to read between the lines too much on that. Calling the Revelation 14:12 Natsarim Jews and then insisting they are incompetent to form a correct judgment is laughable, since he never once gives a chapter and verse, while the Nazarene have the entire Bible at their disposal. I mean, think about that. They're doing away with the entire Bible, telling you not to believe any of it, not to obey any of it. They can't give you any chapter and verse. All they have is Paul's letters at this point. What a boring religion that is. Apparently, everyone at the council was perplexed as to why 2 Passovers are celebrated in a year, which just goes to show how little they'd read of the Torah. There are 2 Passovers. Anyways, Constantine's dismissal of the first 9/10 of the book, which he claims to be a defender of, couldn't be made any clearer. In stating that there is a 1/10 percentage of lawlessness in Scripture, I am giving you, Paul, the Patsy fanboys, a participation point, though even Paul was Torah observant. So I would say 100% of the Bible is Torah accurate, but I'll give the 1/10 for the Paul fanboys. And even if he wasn't Torah observant or isn't, it just goes to show the insane level of cognitive dissonance out there that anyone would claim to be a Bible believer and go out there and tell people they need to repent and believe in the Bible, but then tell people not to believe in it. Don't do what it said. Did God really say? Does anybody else see the irony that every author of the Bible was either the house of Yasharel or the Yahudim? Now, in conclusion, the church was headed up by the spiritual tares whom Yahushua warned us about. But are you really surprised? Oops, I nearly forgot everyone's favorite saint, Augustine of Hippo. He comes up often around here, and I'm sure he has something to say about it. This is what he says. The true image of the Hebrew is Judas Iscariot, who sells the Lord for silver. The Jew can never understand the scriptures and forever will bear the guilt for the death of Jesus. So no matter how much you read of the Bible, no matter how much you quote it, no matter how much you do what it says to do, you apparently cannot understand it, because if you did, you wouldn't do it. And that proves that you're Judas Iscariot. No, sir, I be guessing wrong again. Misa thought Massa mightn't reason with me in the big house, but the Hebrew man is too stupid to how they talking with him, being so Jew in the head and all. Looks like there were still Natsarim in Augustine's day, refusing to take their medicine like a good boy. They just go on in their persistence, obeying the commands put forward by Yahuwah against the advice of Augustine and his crew and the church and his spy network. How dare they? Can you believe it? They keep the Sabbath and avoid the Boston butts. Must be bearing the guilt for the death of Yahushua HaMashiach then. Yes, that must be it. Is it too late to point out that the very word Hebrew does not incite a Jew? It is indicative of crossing over, just as Abraham had already done. And there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew. That comes from Genesis 14:13. He wasn't a Jew. I think we are all aware that Abraham was not a Yahud. His great-grandson would become a Yahud, one of them in the very least. He was named Yehuda. He was, however, a Hebrew. Abraham was. There is an ongoing debate as to what classifies a Hebrew. Some would say a Hebrew is indicative of an ethnonym, such as a son of Shem, perchance even a Phoenician. And this may turn out to be true in the more general sense. I am in agreement, however, with those who hypothesize that a Hebrew describes a migrant from across the river, being especially indicative of one who has crossed over the river, the River Jordan. It is certainly interesting to see Augustine compare the prototype Hebrew to Judas Iscariot then, ain't it? Time and again, we see the tares blame shifting, projecting themselves onto others, villainizing the people of Yahuwah so as to make themselves the model citizen in their rebellion. In the game of Red Rover, Christians love to hold hands and call the Jews right over, saddened that they won't come, perplexed that they hold any other understanding of the Bible than the one they've been told or programmed into believing through Paul's letters, one in which they are called to be righteous and obedient to the Alahayim of Yasharel, the Jews. They just don't get it. No son of Yasharel would, in the right mind, return from their crossing point to embrace a lawless Christ. Gentile Christians actually think they are doing Yasharel a favor in telling them their version of the good news, that the instructions in righteous living has been done away with. They will then label the Natsarim heretics, while the Natsarim just stand there holding the line and shaking their heads thinking, have these people even read the Bible? Now, either Augustine had his way and placed all the naughty Natsarim in timeout, or something else happened, because mention of the Revelation 14:12 crowd went suspiciously silent. Were they finally snuffed out? Don't count on it. Augustine died in 430, and you probably know my opinion by this point in our relationship. The fire reset of 536 initiated the fall of Camelot in 537, which then brought about the year of the apocalypse in 541. Those are all presentations I've given. Those are all papers. The millennial kingdom followed. And by that, I'm inciting a physical manifestation of Yahushua's kingdom upon the earth. I've given my reasons in the 7,000-year timeline deception, as well as in countless other papers, and we'll continue to develop them. Next week, I'm going to have another for you, a follow-up to the Nazarene, specifically on the millennial kingdom. Here's a twist to the puzzle. A guy named Bonacursus, sounds like a dinosaur, a 12th century Cathar who converted to Catholicism, released a confessional report to the people of Milan exposing the quasi-Gnostic nature of the Cathar heresy, and also another group which he dubbed the Passagian heresy. And here's how he describes them. Let those who are not yet acquainted with them please note how perverse their belief and doctrine are. First, they teach that we should obey the law of Moses, according to the letter, the Sabbath and circumcision and the legal precepts still being in force. Say it ain't so. Furthermore, to increase their error, they condemn and reject all the church fathers, and the whole Roman church. That's where you get yourself in trouble right there, when you reject the church fathers and the Roman church, the traditions of men, and you reject your controllers, you're in some deep water, hot water. Oh, wow, so perverse. Hide your wife, hide your kids. Think of the scandal. You mean to tell me that people obeyed the Torah and kept the Sabbath, and that they were furthermore rejecting the jab of lawlessness that the boys were cooking up and handing out down at the Augustinian monastery, or the spy network? Looks like there were some light in the dark ages after all. If Bonacursus, it's actually his name. Well, hold on, guys. Bonacursus. It's actually cursus. Bonacursus. If Bonacursus is writing a travel brochure, then where do I sign up, and how much does a one-way ticket cost? Because they sound like my sort of people. I'm as suspicious of the timeline as the next suspicious man, and especially question any of these medieval dates. But one thing is certain: the Natsarim existed. They thrived. They continued on generation after generation. The light of the menorah was never darkened, nor was there a time in his story when the ecclesia went extinct. As Yahuwah told Eliyahu the prophet, he had his reserve, and that'd be Elijah. The Natsarim had the truth on their side, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Our controllers knew it, and they couldn't handle it, the truth, that is. Which is why official history is never written in such a way to tell the losing side of the argument. The victors may still be in control, but they will have their day. Now, I want to leave you on this last portion tonight, and this is where I think you guys are going to really dig this. This is where it really hits home. Christianity versus the millennial kingdom. This is where I changed the name of this video. Bet you didn't think I'd tie the Natsarim in with the millennial kingdom. You thought you had me a moment ago when I read from a medieval reference and scratched my head while doing it, unsure about the timeline. Come on. We all know his story has been toyed with. I'm not in the least concerned about sticking the landing with every single medieval reference. Just know this is the part where I show you that the millennial kingdom, as a physical manifestation upon the earth, was a Nazarene notion. It has already been established that Yochanan was Nazarene, and Philip, founder of the Orthodox Church, along with his 3 daughters, were Nazarene. Though I think they would say Andrew is the founder of the Orthodox Church. You'll want to keep them in mind because they will be referenced again. Paul the Patsy was Nazarene. The Ecclesia of Antioch and Jerusalem remained a stronghold of Nazarene for centuries. Polycarp was Nazarene and apparently in deep doo-doo for being one. Of course, he was the leader of the Eastern Church. In his letter, as well as in Irenaeus's intervention, Polycarp was outed as Nazarene among a host of others. Far too many to list. Polycarp, of course, was a disciple of Yochanan, by which we come to learn of another disciple of Yochanan, Papias, bishop of Hierapolis. I don't actually know where that is exactly. Rather than leave you hanging, you might as well have it out. Yep, he too was Nazarene. No, pay attention to this. Most of what we know about him comes to us by way of Eusebius, church historian under Constantine, by which the following quote is a derivative of his. My intent is not to recover every known detail regarding Papias' life, but rather to establish his credentials and afterwards make the Nazarene and millennial kingdom connection. Irenaeus, or Irenaeus, it's getting late, guys, and others record that John, the theologian and apostle, survived until the time of Trajan. After this, Papias and Polycarp, bishop of Smyrna, both of whom had heard him, became well known. At this time, there flourished in Asia Polycarp, the disciple of the apostles, who had been appointed to the office of bishop of the church in Smyrna by the eyewitness and ministers of the Lord. At this time, Papias, who was himself bishop of the diocese of Hierapolis, became well known. 5 books of Papias are in circulation, which are titled Expositions of the Sayings of the Lord. Irenaeus also mentions these as the only works written by him, saying something like this: Papias, a man of the early period who was a hearer of John and companion of Polycarp, bears witness to these things in writing in the 4th of his books. For there are 5 books composed by him. This comes from fragments of Papias 1 through 3. So far, what have we learned? Irenaeus was personally acquainted with Papias on the basis that he was allied with Polycarp, being spiritual kin. The two were personally appointed by eyewitnesses of Mashiach, and Papias, like Polycarp, was instructed at the feet of Yochanan. Though we still don't know much of Polycarp's writing habits, Papias wrote a whopper of a book, complete with the provocative title, Expositions of the Sayings of the Lord. Did you catch the part where it ended up being a 5-volume set? You mean to tell me there's a collection of 5 books floating around out there which purports to collect sayings of Yahushua HaMashiach from those who personally heard him speak? Yes, please. Just take my money. Eusebius, writing during the lifetime of Constantine, says they're still in circulation. Still in circulation implies they could be picked up at the local bookstore, biography section. Where can I purchase my copies? Take my money. I'll take several of them. How about I just throw my wallet at you? Oh wait, they've been scrubbed, haven't they? I knew it. You've got to be kidding me. A guy is personally instructed at the feet of Yochanan and faithfully takes up the pen to record the sayings of Mashiach from the generation which heard him in person. And they did it. They really did it. There was a book burning for all 5 volumes, and I wasn't invited. I would be just grabbing those books and running away as fast as I could. Makes you wonder what was contained within, doesn't it? The original hearers and doers of Mashiach wouldn't happen to be Nazarene, would they? Well, let's see what else we can glean from the man. The following quotations comes from Jerome, who was still kicking until 420, telling us that Papias survived at least until the late 4th or early 5th century. meaning the writings of Papias, survived until at least the 5th century. And this is what we read. Papias, a hero of John and bishop in Asia, wrote only 5 books, which he titled An Exposition of the Discourses of the Lord. In them, when he asserts in his preface that he is not following diverse conjectures, but has the apostles as his authorities, he says, I used to inquire about what Andrew or Peter had said, or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew or any other of the Lord's disciples, and what Aristion and John the Elder, disciples of the Lord, were saying. For books to read are not as useful to me as the living voice sounding out clearly up to the present day in the persons of their authors. Fragments of Papias 7:1-4. So it wasn't simply sayings of Yahushua HaMashiach which filled his 5-volume epic, but those of Andre, Kepha, Philip, Theon, Yaakov, Yochanan, and Mattathiyahu, among other Talmudim, the Dirty Dozen. He also mentions an Aristion and Yochanan the Elder, whom he knew in person. They are claimed to have been personal Talmudim of Mashiach, though not the 12, and a common consensus is that Yochanan the Elder was the author of 2nd and 3rd John, not Yochanan, the writer of the Gospel or Revelation, or 1st Yochanan. Just so we're clear, Paul was never instructed by Mashiach in person. His sayings filled 12 books of the NT, 13 by some estimates. Contrarily, the actual quotations and teachings of those who did learn from Mashiach in person are suspiciously absent. Papias is quipped regarding his preference to be schooled by actual people, in this case, those who had been personally instructed by Yahusha, rather than the books being written, appears to be what irked the Circus Fathers the most. And you could see why. It may not have been abundantly clear when quoting from Eusebius, but the church fathers were totally embarrassed by Papias. They thought he was a complete imbecile. They wanted him removed from the discussion. They called him stupid, like slow-witted or whatever, as if that's not evident by their resounding success. You see, the church fathers wanted to claim an apostolic tradition and eventually a papal tradition using their teachings, and obviously the teachings of the Natsarim didn't fit the mold. They had to go. Rather than jumping to the usual predictable conclusions, which tend to turn out correct more often than not, let's keep scrounging around in the ash pile, see what the CSI team can dig up. So reading once more from Papias, or the fragments of Papias. The blessing thus foretold undoubtedly belongs to the times of the kingdom, when the righteous will rise from the dead and reign, when creation too, renewed and freed from bondage, will produce an abundance of food of all kings from the dew of heaven and from the fertility of the earth. Just as the elders who saw John the disciple of the Lord recalled having heard from him how the Lord used to teach about those times and say, the days will come when vines will grow, each having 10,000 shoots, and on each shoot 10,000 branches, and on each branch 10,000 twigs, and on each twig 10,000 clusters, and in each cluster 10,000 grapes, and each grape when crushed will yield 25 measures of wine. Sounds amazing. And when one of the saints takes hold of a cluster, another cluster will cry out, I am better, take me. Bless Adonai through me. Similarly, a grain of wheat will produce 10,000 heads, and every head will have 10,000 grains, and every grain 10 pounds of fine flour, white and clean. And the other fruits, seeds and grass, will produce in similar proportions, and all the animals feeding on these fruits produced by the soil will in turn become peaceful and harmonious toward one another and fully subject to mankind. Amazing. He's talking about a Jubilee year. I went ahead and took out the highlighter as well as the red marker for you, making sure to illuminate the entire passage. You're welcome. Can I get an amen? Somebody, anybody in the comment sections? Somebody, amen. I don't usually ask for an amen, but come on. That wasn't simply an amen moment. It was an all-main amazing, awesome moment. It just so happens to be a direct quote from the Lord, Adonai, a.k.a. Yahuwah in the person of Yahushua HaMashiach. telling his hearers about what they could expect in the coming kingdom, the physical manifestation of his kingdom on the earth. We're talking 1,000-year reign territory, the millennial kingdom, and just a taste of what we might otherwise find in Papias's 5-volume set. It wasn't simply a spiritual kingdom. Yahusha spoke of a fully realized physical one. Makes one weep for what was lost, don't it? And why, pray tell, do we even have this savory quote to go by? Well, the person who happens to have scribbled it down is none other than Papias's old college buddy, Irenaeus. Irenaeus was fascinated by Papias's work. Unlike the others who called him a complete imbecile, he was like, this guy heard from the apostles and he wrote down the sayings of the Lord, of Adonai. He knew Papias personally, could attest to his fruit, and believe the resulting words of his lifetime research to be accurate. Mind you, Papias wasn't simply speaking to one or two individuals and then twisting the words with fill-in-the-blank conjectures. The guy was playing traffic cop, lighting up the red and the blue for every single witness who passed his way, taking down their statements for his record keeping. He'd even hound them down when he could. Papias delivered for us a cloud of witnesses, 5 volumes worth, and from what I can tell, it wasn't contradictions which had the church fathers up in arms. No, it was the unified vision of the apostles and the elders under them which irked them so, particularly their Nazarene vision. And topping the list was the millennial kingdom. So returning once more to Eusebius, this is what he says. The same writer, Papias, has recorded other accounts as having come to him from unwritten tradition, certain strange parables of the Lord and teachings of his, and some other statements of a more mythical character. Among other things, he says that after the resurrection of the dead, there will be a period of 1,000 years when the kingdom of Christ will be set up in material form on this earth. These ideas, I suppose, he got through a misunderstanding of the apostolic accounts, not realizing that things recorded in figurative language were spoken by them mystically. For he certainly appears to be a man of very little intelligence, as one may say, judging from his own words. Yet he was the reason that so many ecclesiastical writers after him held the same opinion on the grounds that he was a man of the early period, like Irenaeus, for example, and anyone else who has expressed similar ideas. I will again remind you that the person being quoted from is Eusebius, Constantine's biographer. He criticizes Papias for jotting down mystical sayings by Mashiach, only to turn around and claim that Papias was being far too exoteric in describing sayings of a mystical nature, that being the anticipated millennial kingdom. So he's criticizing him for saying mystical things that Messiah said, but then he's saying, well, no, he actually was speaking mystical things, but you're misinterpreting them and making them too exoteric. You have to look at it from a mystical nature. Projecting onto Papias, are we? Apparently, and to quote Eusebius, the man who recorded a 5-volume collection of sayings from Mashiach, the apostles and elders, was far too stupid to be bothered with. If only they had left his books on the shelf so that we could be the judge of that. But of course, anyone who believes the kingdom to be a physical one is falling under the error of the cloud of witnesses who reported to him. In other news, Constantine was the kingdom, and we can't have the Natsarim rising from the dead to judge their going persecutors now, can we? Another passage from fragments of Papias. Taking their cue from the great Papias, who was a disciple of the bosom friend, and Clement from Pantanus, the priest of the Alexandrians, and Ammonius, the most learned scholar, those ancient and earliest interpreters who agree with each other in understanding the whole, there it is, 6 days to refer to Christ and the church. So the idea of the 6 days of creation being 6,000 years with 1,000 years of rest, those would be the earliest. And Clement, he's talking about Clement of Rome. And he most certainly did believe that. He talked about the phoenix and other things like that. So this comes from Anastasius of Sinai, is the one doing the talking this time around. I just want to quickly point out that the 6 days teaching belongs to the earliest of interpreters, all of whom agreed with each other and in turn had been reared by the instruction of the apostles. And of course, the later church followers wanted to turn that vision away from an actual 6,000 to 7,000 year understanding of history. Clement of Rome is numbered among them. I've covered his important part in the 7,000 year timeline discussion in various other places, particularly as he pertains to the Phoenix. Well, then, now that we can confirm they were all Natsarim, check this quote out. Again, from fragments of Papias. He is the one who is said to have promulgated the Jewish tradition of a millennium. And he is followed by Irenaeus, Apollinarius, and others who say that after the resurrection of the Lord will reign in the flesh with the saints. A few pages ago, I quoted from Jerome, but then didn't finish his closing statement. I wasn't ready to go there yet. He too was not a fan. And now you know the reason why. He was one of them Sabbath Judaizers, totally unashamed of the Jew tax. Supposing 1,000-year reign did begin from the year 6,000 through 7,000, as the Nazarene claimed, then that would verify the Sabbath, as well as high Sabbath feasts like Sukkot, which would furthermore confirm what every confirming Revelation 14:12 person already knows: the Torah abides. Today, there is a great awakening to the notion, and in the very least, the stunning possibility that the 1,000-year reign of Yahushua HaMashiach physically manifested upon the earth. Ironically, sentiments such as what I've just described are mostly advocated from those who reject the Torah, the commands, the Sabbath, and the Nazarene lifestyle, wanting nothing to do with Yahuwah's instructions in righteous living. In fact, many are hoping to silence anyone who would advocate for them. Can they not at least appreciate the irony? They are attempting to silence the very character of Yahushua HaMashiach, as well as his apostles, the elders, and the Allahayam, our Father in heaven, and Allahayam, our Father in heaven, just as our controllers have done and continue to do. All right, thank you for sitting through this with me. I got through that. That was a lot of stuff, so go back and watch it again. Might I point out, for those of you who are still with me, to check out the link under this video for the ministry funds. Make sure that we're up to par this month. Make sure we're coming in where we should be, and pray to Yah about potentially giving to this ministry, and I would greatly appreciate it. I'm going to be going over to Discord for anybody who is wanting to be a part of the after party. We can talk about this. We can talk about other things. I will see you guys over there in a few minutes. Shalom, everybody.